Stephen is actually starting to preach to the council, right? He is defending himself, although we've talked about the fact that I don't know how much he was defending himself as much as he was taking the opportunity to preach to them what he thought they needed to hear. Because if a guy is trying to get himself out of trouble, he doesn't usually look at the judges and say, "You guys are guilty." It's not the best way to get yourself out of trouble. So although he was to some degree defending himself, I think more than anything he was declaring to these men what they needed to hear. Now remember, we talked about the fact that in Acts chapter 6, Stephen was elected as what we would today call a deacon. He didn't just do those responsibilities, but he was a man full of the Holy Ghost. He was a man known for his honesty and his wisdom, and he is declaring to people the Lord Jesus Christ. And they start to take offense at this. He's preaching to guys like Saul of Tarsus, right? Who would later become Paul, the Apostle Paul, and people like him who were Jewish, but were not from Jerusalem, right? We remember in Acts chapter 6 that he was preaching to the people of this certain synagogue, a synagogue of people that were from other countries. And as he preached to them, they couldn't dispute what he was saying. It says that they couldn't overcome his wisdom. And so what they did is they started to get people to make false accusations against him, or really probably based on the accusations that were levied against him, they probably were just taking his words and twisting them a little bit, right? And he's really on trial at this point for a couple things. He's on trial for basically, they claim, saying that we should do away with the law of Moses, that the traditions of Moses and the law of Moses needed to be changed and done away with, and that Christ was going to destroy the temple. And so those are kind of the things that are laid at his feet. And so as he gets in here to Acts chapter 7 and he starts to preach to them, we've seen how that what he's done is he's basically started, he said, listen, you guys need to listen to me. And he starts all the way back with Abraham, and he starts to talk about how Abraham was called. Listen, Stephen is showing that he knows the story. Stephen is showing that he knows that the people have been called, right? That Abraham was called. But the other thing I want you to know is that as Stephen is going and he talks about Abraham and he talks about Jacob and he talks about Joseph and he talks about Moses, listen, the other thing that he's doing is he's telling them it's not just all about the fact that we're the seed of Abraham. What Abraham did in the covenant that God made with Abraham was so much deeper than the physical. Listen, God's calling of Moses and what he did with Moses is so much deeper than the physical. Listen, the tabernacle and the temple is so much deeper than the physical. All of those things were pointing to the anointed one, to the Holy One. And as he gets to that point, he tells them, the one that you crucified. So listen, understand, even though I'm taking my time and I'm hitting every one of these references that Stephen just simply gives a summary of, each of those things is a foreshadowing of the coming of Jesus Christ. The covenant that God had with Abraham, yes, was there something special about the nation of Israel? Absolutely. But don't forget that God had promised Abraham that from his seed all nations would be blessed. Right? And that is something that these people that he was preaching to had missed, had forgotten, maybe didn't understand. And so I think Stephen is taking this opportunity to try to remind them it's so much more than what you think it is. Now, in your paper, and I apologize for the quality, my printer was messing up a little bit. We have already covered Genesis chapter 12, where God called Abraham and he promised a great nation, and from his seed all nations would be blessed. We covered Genesis chapter 12, verse 7, and chapter 13, verses 14 through 7, which was a promise of the land being given to his seed. Now, all of these things on my paper are things that Stephen has quoted or referenced, and we've already covered, and I'm just giving you a summary of where we've already been. In Genesis chapter 15, verses 13 through 21, there was a prophecy that the people of Abraham would enter into another land, and that they would grow there, and that they would be nurtured there, but then that nation would turn against them, and then God would call them out. Now, obviously, he's speaking of the children of Israel going into Egypt, and then the Exodus, and the return to the Promised Land. In Genesis chapter 17, verses 10 and 12, and Genesis chapter 21, verse 34, we're given the sign of circumcision as a sign of the covenant, right? Now, I think it's important to understand that circumcision was simply a sign of the covenant, right? But even that was not just a physical thing, because there are places in the Old Testament where God tells them, you are uncircumcised in heart. Listen, you could do circumcision, you could do the sacrifices, you could do the offerings, and be completely and totally not God's. Not of God is what I'm saying, not God's people, His children, right? Because these things, although they were an outward symbol, they were supposed to be an outward symbol of what was in the heart. And so we've covered that. Genesis chapter 37, verse 28, and Genesis 39, verse 2, we see where Joseph is sold into slavery, but God was still with him. And we saw how that even though it looked bad, he then got put into Potiphar's house and things started looking up. Right? He was put in charge of Potiphar's house. But then Potiphar's wife made advances against him, which he declined, and she then made false accusations, and Joseph's thrown into prison. Man, things are looking down again. But while he's in prison, he meets these two guys that have dreams. He interprets the dreams. Those dreams come true. The guy that's released is supposed to remember Joseph. He doesn't. Joseph stays in prison. But then Pharaoh has a dream. Just so happens, right? Just by chance, just by luck, quote unquote. One of Pharaoh's servants happens to know a guy that can interpret dreams. God is planning and moving in Joseph's individual life, and all the ups and all the downs, they're not random. They're happening for a reason and a purpose. And as he moves in Joseph's life, he's moving in Joseph's family. And as he's moving in Joseph's family, he's moving in entire nations. And not only is he moving in entire nations, we talked about last time how he's moving in time. Because listen, the things that happened to Joseph were laying the groundwork for something that would happen a few hundred years later when they would come out of the nation of Egypt. But listen, even that is not just how he was moving in time, because the Exodus out of Egypt, we see things like the Passover, which gives us that perfect picture of something that happened thousands of years later. And then we see all of these things start to take place, right? When God was moving in Joseph's life, did you know that he was actually moving in yours too? I say, what do you mean? Well, through Abraham's seed, all nations would be blessed. Well, that's you and me. What God did with Joseph in helping bring the children of Israel into Egypt so they could grow protected and matured and become a mighty nation and then be driven out of Egypt and to go to the Promised Land, well, eventually the Messiah came from all of that. And the Messiah died for even us. You see what I'm saying? God is so big and so powerful, He doesn't just move in this little thing and that's it. Well, what he does today might be something that he's setting the stage for 10 years from now, 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now. So we see in Genesis chapter 41, verse 16, and Genesis 30, and verses 38 through 44, Joseph becomes governor over Egypt. He is so in favor of Pharaoh that Pharaoh makes him second in command. There is nobody other than Pharaoh that's more important in the entire nation of Egypt other than Joseph. We talked about last time, if you look at some of the stuff, Joseph had control over everything. The only thing he didn't have control over was Pharaoh's priests. Like literally about everything else he had control over. In Genesis 41, chapter 41, verses 54 through 57, and then Genesis 42, verses 1 through 2, we see that Jacob sends his sons to Egypt during the drought. In Genesis 45, verses 1 through 16, Joseph is revealed to his family and is made known to Pharaoh. And then Joseph gives God the credit for sending him to Egypt. I love that. I made a note of that in the notes. When he's talking to his brothers, and his brothers are worried that Joseph is this great and powerful guy, and we're the ones that sold him into slavery, Joseph says, don't worry about it. That was God's plan the whole time. Like, this is what God meant for me. I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for this. And if I wasn't here, there wouldn't be somewhere for you to go to have food. God knows what He's doing. And then in Genesis chapter 46, verses 26 and 27, Jacob and all his family come into Egypt. Now, I have a little note in here that we talked about this last time, there's some differences in the number of people that Genesis states and the number of people that Stephen states, but I think that's all explainable based on the wording, because one of them is talking about the number of people that came out of Jacob's loins, and one of them is talking about the total number of people that came into Egypt, and then you have to do some subtraction. Well, Joseph was already there, his sons were already there, Genesis wasn't counting some of the wives, so I think it's all explainable. And then really where we ended up last time in Acts chapter 7, we're really in verse 18, where it talks about till another king arose which knew not Joseph. But I do want to do one thing before we go into verse 18. It says in verse 17 of Acts chapter 7, but when the time of the promise drew nigh, which God had sworn to Abraham, the people grew and multiplied in Egypt. Now, I want to think about that here. If you turn with me to the book of Joshua, chapter 24. Joshua, chapter 24. Verse 32. It says, and the bones of Joseph, which the children of Israel brought up out of Egypt, buried they in Shechem in a parcel of ground which Jacob bought of the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, for 100 pieces of silver, and it became the inheritance of the children of Joseph. Now I read that, and I have a purpose, because to some degree I'm getting ahead of myself. I understand that Joshua 24 is talking about how when they came out of the land of Egypt, they actually brought the bones of Joseph with them. Okay? We are talking a long, long time after Joseph died. Okay? Why did they bring the bones of Joseph with them? And I think this ties back into Acts for a couple things. One, Stephen makes the claim that although the children of Israel came into Egypt, that they were also taken back out. And he talks about the fathers, the patriarchs, being taken out. Well, listen, Jacob, when he died, was actually taken back and buried somewhere other than Shechem. We know based on the Old Testament, that Joseph was specifically carried out of the land of Egypt and buried in Shechem. Acts actually makes it sound like Joseph was maybe not the only one of the 12 that was carried out. It doesn't specifically say, but the wording does indicate in Acts that it talks about our fathers were brought out. I don't know for sure, but I do know Joseph was. I know for a fact Joseph was, right? Well, listen, there's a couple things that go on. I want you to look in Genesis chapter 50. Genesis chapter 50. Joshua 24 is really a fulfillment of a promise that was made in Genesis chapter 50. We're going to start in verse 22. It says, "And Joseph dwelt in Egypt, he and his father's house, and Joseph lived 110 years. And Joseph saw Ephraim's children of the third generation. The children also of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were brought up upon Joseph's knee." Now understand what this is saying is that as Joseph is living his life in Egypt and his family has now come, his own kids start to have kids, right? And his grandkids have kids. This tells us that Joseph's great-grandkids were brought up on his knee. They would have heard firsthand from Joseph the stories of him being sold into Egypt and Potiphar and how he was thrown in prison and how he was brought out and how he was made second in command of Egypt. Literally, his great-grandkids would have sat on his knee, it says. In verse 24, "And Joseph said unto his brethren, I die." He's dying. And he gathers together his brethren and he tells them in verse 24, "And God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land unto the land which we swear to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob." He is referring to something that Stephen has actually already referred to also. And he's referring to a promise that was given to Abraham. If you remember in Genesis, God had told Abraham, your seed is going to be taken off into another foreign land, and I'm going to grow them there, and they're going to be there 400 years, and then I'm going to bring them out. But before I bring them out, that nation is going to turn against them and deal with them. This is a promise. This is a prophecy that's been given. Joseph is fully, I want you to notice this, Joseph is fully aware of that promise. Man, he is second in command in all of Egypt. If anything, you would think he would want to root and ground his people in this country where he is second in command. But he has apparently set the stage for them saying, listen, there is coming a time where God is going to come back for you. And he is going to bring you out. And when that happens, I want you to take my body with you. And I want to be buried in the promised land. You know what that's called? That's called faith. Do you see the faith of Joseph? Knowing he will never see the day, he makes them promise that when the day does come, he will be taken with them. Because as far as he's concerned, it's a done deal. It's not maybe it's going to happen. It's when it happens, take my body with you. Listen, he is laying for them a reminder that God is coming. Now, I want you, the Bible doesn't specifically say this, but the fact that probably a few hundred years before this happened, Joseph makes them promise. And then whenever they leave, they do it. It's been passed down from generation to generation to generation. Understand that by the time God sent Moses, at least somebody, maybe not the multitudes, but at least somebody remembered that promise that Joseph had them make years before. Because I believe, as you think about, you look at what Joseph said, that even his great-grandkids were brought up on his knee. Don't tell me that Joseph wasn't passing along the promises that God had given to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob. And then when he died, he made them promise, you will take me with you. And I believe that Joseph served as a reminder for generations, God is coming. Listen, you and me today, what we pass on to our kids is very important. I don't know when God is coming back, but God said He's coming back. And we need to be living our life and telling our kids and showing them the promises that He has already fulfilled and the promises that He is going to fulfill. And we need to live our life like it's not that those things might happen, but that those things are going to happen. That's what Joseph did. And he even left them with a reminder. Man, when you guys leave, take me with you. So I didn't want to keep going without drawing out that as you really think about what Stephen has said, man, Joseph showed by faith he believed God. He believed God. Now, we also see in Acts chapter 7, verse 18, till another king arose which knew not Joseph. Now that statement comes right after saying, when the time of promise drew nigh. Now if you go back and look, you understand that God's promise to Abraham was so specific that He even gave time periods. And it says, when the time of promise drew nigh, guess what? The tides started changing. They had been in great favor, but whenever a king arose that had never met Joseph and didn't know Joseph, maybe didn't know of Joseph, suddenly it changed. And you start to see the fulfillment of that in Exodus chapter 1, which is really what he's referring to here. Exodus chapter 1. If you pick up in verse 6, it says, and Joseph died and all his brethren and all that generation. And the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly and multiplied and waxed exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them. Verse 8, now there arose up a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph. And he said unto his people, behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come on, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply, and it come to pass that when there falleth out any war, they join also unto our enemies and fight against us, and so get them up out of the land. Therefore they did set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens, and they built for Pharaoh's treasure cities, Pithom and Rameses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew, and they were grieved because of the children of Israel. Well, that's exactly what Stephen is talking about in verse 18 of Acts chapter 7, where he says, till another king arose, which knew not Joseph. In verse 19, the same dealt subtly with our kindred, and evil entreated our fathers, so that they cast out their young children to the end that they might not live. Now we understand that as you continue to read Exodus chapter 1, it even says in verse 13, and the Egyptians made the children of Israel to serve with rigor, and they made their lives bitter with hard bondage in mortar and in brick and in all manner of service in the field, and all the service wherein they made them serve was with rigor. And the king of Egypt spake to the Hebrew midwives, of which one of them was Shephareth, and the name of the other Puah. And he said, when ye do the office of the midwife to the Hebrew women, and see them upon the stools. If it be a son, then ye shall kill him. But if it be a daughter, then she shall live. But the midwives feared God, and did not as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the men, children alive. And the king of Egypt called for the midwives, and said unto them, Why have ye done this thing, and have saved the men children alive? And the midwives said unto Pharaoh, Because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women, for they are lively and are delivered ere the midwives come in unto them. Therefore God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and waxed very mighty. And it came to pass, because the midwives feared God, that he made them houses. In verse 22, And Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, Every son that is born ye shall cast into the river, and every daughter ye shall save alive. When the first plan didn't work, the next plan was to turn everybody else against them. And if you find that they have a child that's a son, you take that child and you throw that child in the river. You throw that son in the river. That's what, as you look at Stephen, that's what he's saying. They dealt subtly with them, and they evil entreated them, and they cast out their young children to the end that they might not live. And then in verse 20, he says, In which time Moses was born, and was exceeding fair, and nourished up in his father's house 3 months. And when he was cast out, Pharaoh's daughter took him up and nourished him for her own son. And Moses was learned in the wisdom of the Egyptians, and was mighty in word and in deed. So what happened to Moses, right? Hey, people are getting, if they find your kid, they take your kid and they throw it in the river. Well, what we see in Exodus chapter 2, you see here in verses 1 through verse 10, And there went a man in the house of Levi, and took to wife a daughter of Levi, and the woman conceived and bare a son. And when she saw him that he was a goodly child, she hid him 3 months. Whoa, what was it Stephen said? 3 months. And when she could not longer hide him, she took for him an ark of bulrushes, and daubed it with slime and with pitch, and put the child therein, and she laid it in the flags of the river's brink. And his sister stood afar off, to wit what would be done to him. And the daughter of Pharaoh came down to wash herself at the river, and her maidens walked along by the river's side. When she saw the ark among the flags, she sent her maid to fetch it. And when she had opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the babe wept, and she had compassion on him, and said, This is one of the Hebrews' children. Then said his sister to Pharaoh's daughter, Go and call to that she may nurse the child for thee. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, Go. And the maid went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, Take this child away and nurse it for me, and I will give thee thy wages. And the woman took the child and nursed it, and the child grew, and she brought him into Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she called his name Moses, and she said, Because I drew him out of the water. You look at this, and you see again God's amazing work in this, right? And Stephen is recounting and reminding them of God's moving in the children of Israel. And listen, Moses, 3 months he's hid, and when they can't, he is put in the river, but he's put in this ark, and then Pharaoh's daughter finds him, and she has compassion on him, and man, the mom gets to take him and to nurse him and to raise him up until he's old enough not to be nursed anymore. And then he's put back in Pharaoh's house. Excuse me. And he's actually taken and he's taught the things of the Egyptians, and he grows mighty. He's Pharaoh's, treated like Pharaoh's grandson. Man, God has this ability, right, to put people where He needs them and where He wants them. God is moving, and God has a plan that will not be overthrown by anything, right? Stephen knows these stories. Listen, Stephen has no intention of altering God's plan. Stephen has been accused of saying we should throw the law out and we should get rid of the traditions of Moses. Man, Stephen knows why Moses did what Moses did. Stephen knows why God called him. Stephen knows how God called him. Stephen understands the Old Testament scriptures. But Stephen actually understands that those things didn't just happen because of the physical need of the nation of Israel, but that there was much more of a spiritual aspect of this thing. And we see that he's learned in the ways of the Egyptians. And it says in verse 23 of Acts chapter 7, "And when he was fully 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brethren and the children of Israel. And seeing one of them suffer wrong, he defended him and avenged him that was oppressed, and smote the Egyptian. For he supposed his brethren would have understood how that God by his hand would deliver them, but they understood not. And the next day he showed himself unto them as they strove, and would have set them at one again, saying, Sirs, ye are brethren, why do ye wrong one to another? But he that did his neighbor wrong thrust him away, saying, Who made thee a ruler and a judge over us? Wilt thou kill me as thou didst the Egyptian yesterday? And then fled Moses at this saying, and was a stranger in the land of Midian, where he begat 2 sons." There's some interesting things about this story. You see here the way Stephen describes it, you almost envision that Moses had an idea of being able to deliver his people. Now it's interesting. It may not have been the way Moses intended it to happen. Because you see, almost as you read these stories, Moses maybe thought that his way of deliverance was, hey, I've been put in Pharaoh's house. I'm in a position of power now. I'm going to be able to be an influencer, and I'm going to be able to deliver these people. And when he started to help, we see that even the people he was trying to help didn't want his interference, and started to say they would rat him out for what he had done to the other Egyptian. Well, now his position of power is in danger, and he has to leave the country. And when the Lord eventually does call Moses, Moses actually doesn't want to go. Isn't it interesting how things like that work? Man, this is what God's going to do, and we see a little bit of it, and we start to think, well, I know how we're going to accomplish this. And let's just go down this path. But that's not God's plan. God was going to use Moses, but God wasn't going to use Moses the way Moses thought he was going to be used. We need to be careful about that sometimes too in our own life. Listen, sometimes we get this great thing and we got all the logic figured out and, well, this must be the right way to do it. Listen, be ready to do it differently if God leads in a different way. Be ready to do different if God says, nope, that's not what I want. I want you to go this way. Abraham had this problem. If you look at Abraham's life, there were a few times where he believed God, and he believed God was going to make of him a great nation. But maybe it's through the handmaiden, or maybe it's through the servant that I raised in my household. And God had to come along and say, no, it's none of those. Abraham, you have to do it my way. Well, Moses is kind of in that same thing. Hey, I'm going to come in here as this Pharaoh's grandson and I'm going to make a difference. Nope. God says, I need you to be some guy that's just shepherding livestock out in the wilderness. That's the guy I'm going to use. Not Pharaoh's grandson. I'm going to use the shepherd out in the wilderness. And that's a little bit of what we're recounting here. If you want to, we won't necessarily turn to all of these for time's sake, but if you want to see the Old Testament references to those, that's actually in Exodus chapter 2, starting in verse 11, is where you see that. It talks about, it came to pass in those days when Moses was grown, he went out unto his brethren, and he looked on their burdens, and he spied an Egyptian smiting a Hebrew, one of his brethren, and he looked this way and that way, and when he saw that there was no man, he slew the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Now, I'm not going to read all of this, but you understand that down through these verses here is where you see where he attacks the Egyptian, and then whenever he tries to help the others, they really don't want him to do that. Man, Moses, you feel sorry for Moses. Moses is a guy that has suffered a lot of rejection in his life. Brother Philip actually talked in Sunday school about how that after they were out of the land of Egypt and they had the plan and they were traveling and they were doing all this stuff and they were heading toward the promised land, Man, his own cousins, I guess it would have been, turned on him and tried to revolt, made accusations about him. And really, if you study it, throughout the entire time in the wilderness, you see that off and on, right? For as much as the future nation of Israel would lift Moses up on a pedestal, the people that Moses actually served, not so much. But you see here in this, you see this recounting of how he had to flee to Midian. It says in verse 16, now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water and filled it in the troughs to water their flocks, and the shepherds came and drove them away, but Moses stood up and helped them and watered the flock. And as you read down through this, he actually ends up marrying in verse 21. And Moses was content to dwell with the man, and he gave Moses Zipporah his daughter, and she bare him a son, and called his name Gershom, for he said, I have been a stranger in a strange land. Now, there's other passages that we could turn to. I actually included it here in your notes. I think it's in Exodus 21, verses 22, and Exodus 18, verses 2 through 4, where you see all of the... where you see 2 sons. Exodus chapter 2, verse 21 through 22, which we just read. Exodus 18, verses 2 through 4, talks about the fact that he had 2 sons. Now, Exodus chapter 3 is what is going to be talked about next. So, verse 30 of Acts chapter 7, and you might as well keep your hands in both Exodus and in Acts. But in Acts chapter 7, verse 30, it says, and when 40 years were expired, there appeared to him in the wilderness of Mount Sinai an angel of the Lord in a flame of fire in a bush. And when he saw it, he wondered at the sight, and as he drew near to behold it, the voice of the Lord came unto him. Now, we don't have time to get into this whole section. We'll have to save this for next time. But I will read a little bit of it. In Exodus chapter 3, it says, now Moses kept the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the backside of the desert and came to the mountain of God, even to Horeb. And the angel of the Lord appeared unto him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush burned with fire, and the bush was not consumed. And Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush is not burnt. And when the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called unto him out of the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, here am I. And he said, draw not nigh hither, but put off thy shoes from thy feet, for the place wherein thou standest is holy ground. Moreover, he said, I am the God of thy father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. Now, don't you think that based on Moses' reaction, I have a feeling Moses had heard some stories. When he's told, I'm the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, Moses knew what that meant. It says that when he heard that, he was afraid to even look on the bush. I truly believe that as Moses, even though he was raised in the Egyptians, man, you understand that whenever they went to take out Joseph's body, people knew about the promise. I believe Moses knew who the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob was. Man, when he's told that, you see his reaction to it, his reverence to it. Now, we don't have time to get into this too deep, but this is some really, really neat passages. And I told you a few times during the course of this, we often think about these stories as being things that should be relegated to small Sunday school classes. Right? You think about, that's I learned that in Sunday school. Stephen is preaching these things as he is on trial for his life, and will eventually give his life after this sermon. Listen, he understands the importance of God's calling of Abraham and the sign of the covenant. He understands God's calling of Moses and the picture that that represents, calling them out of the land of Exodus, or out of the land of Egypt. And Stephen is building up to this point, and I've already said it and I'm going to say it again, but Stephen is building up to the point where he can look at this council and say, you are just like your fathers, you are stiff-necked, and you refuse God's ways. And just like they killed the prophets and abused the prophets, you killed the anointed one. That's what Stephen's building up to. He's showing them and reminding them, yes, God called Abraham. Yes, God called Moses. But your fathers that you like to lift up on high so much, they're the ones that kept rejecting Him. They're the ones that kept following after false gods. And you're just like them. You need to see what you've done. Unfortunately, we know from already reading Acts chapter 7 that they didn't see it. Matter of fact, we know that they eventually end up rejecting Stephen's message. They get so angry at it when they're called out for having crucified the Anointed One that they murder Stephen. And you remember how God was moving in the life of Joseph? And how the things that seemed bad ended up turning out to be for the best? Well, we know that when we're done with Acts chapter 7, that there was a guy sitting at the feet of those that were stoning Stephen. And this guy was a guy by the name of Saul. Listen, what happened to Stephen and the message that Stephen preached never left Saul. You get far enough into Acts, and you will realize that even years later, when Paul himself is now preaching the gospel, and Paul himself is in trouble, he remembers Stephen, and he remembers what happened to Stephen. It never left him. God was moving in Saul's life before Saul even knew that he was moving in his life. The guy that witnessed this message and heard this message and was okay with this guy being stoned was later saved, never forgot what he heard from Stephen, and himself went throughout large portions of this world declaring the very one that Stephen was trying to preach. Man, God knows what He's doing. God has a plan. We need to live our life with faith that God has a plan and God will do what He said He's going to do. Right? All right. We're going to go ahead and end there. We'll ask Brother Philip if he would come and lead us in a song.